It wasn't a letter I was expecting. Most people get a warning, a polite knock, a formal notice slipped under the door, maybe a phone call from a property manager with an apologetic tone. What I got was a certified envelope sitting on the kitchen counter when I came home from my shift, already opened by my wife, because she'd been home all day waiting for something, anything, from the landlord's office. She was sitting at the table, with her hands folded in front of her like she was in church. That was the moment I knew. "They're selling the building," she said. I picked up the letter. 90 days. The whole complex had been acquired by a company called Stonebridge Capital Partners, and they were converting every unit to luxury condominiums. Tenants with active leases would receive 90 days to vacate. There was a number to call if we had questions. I didn't call. There was nothing they were going to tell me that would make 90 days feel like enough time. My wife's name is June. We'd been in that apartment for 6 years. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor of a building in Akron, Ohio, with a parking lot view and a radiator that clanked all winter. But it was ours. We'd painted the kitchen yellow together the second week we moved in. Her mother's quilt was folded over the back of the couch. My son had taken his first steps in that living room. When I say it was ours, I mean it in the way that matters most. It was the place where our life actually happened. I worked maintenance for a school district. June worked part-time at a dental office front desk, while our son, who was 3, stayed with her mother 2 days a week. We weren't behind on rent. We hadn't violated anything. We were just inconvenient. We had about $11,000 in savings. In Akron, in the rental market we were looking at, that didn't stretch the way it sounds. First month, last month, security deposit, 3 months up front. For anything decent, with 2 bedrooms, put us somewhere between tight and impossible. And we needed decent. We had a kid. I spent 3 weeks searching listings. Apartments were either too expensive or had waiting lists. A friend at work told me about a guy he knew who'd rented a room above a garage for $800 a month, no lease, cash only. June looked at me when I told her and didn't say anything. She didn't have to. It was her cousin Robbie who sent us the link. Robbie was the kind of person who was always forwarding things. News articles, YouTube videos, links to properties in rural counties that he thought were interesting. Usually, I ignored them. This one I didn't because the price stopped me cold. $38,000 for a house. It was in a town called Millhaven, about 40 minutes southeast of us. The listing said fixer-upper, which I knew meant problems, and wooded lot, which I knew meant isolated. There were 6 photos. The exterior showed a 2-story farmhouse with a sagging porch, siding that had gone gray with age, and a line of old oak trees along the property edge. Inside, the floors were warped. The kitchen had a drop ceiling with water stains. One of the upstairs rooms had a window that was boarded up with plywood. "It's a wreck," June said. "It's $38,000, I said. We drove out on a Saturday. Our son fell asleep in the back seat. The GPS took us off the highway onto a county road, then onto a gravel lane that wound through a stand of old trees before opening into a clearing. The house sat at the far end. In person it looked both worse and better than the photos. Worse because you could smell the damp from 20 feet away. Better because the bones of it were solid. The porch had settled, but the frame wasn't rotten. The roof was old, but it hadn't failed. The oak trees were massive and beautiful. The listing agent, a woman named Paulette, who'd driven up from the county seat, met us in the driveway. She walked us through fast, the way agents do when they know a property has problems they'd rather not linger on. The kitchen floor had soft spots. One bathroom had mold behind the vanity. The water heater was original to a renovation done sometime in the early 90s, but the lot was 2.5 acres. There were no neighbors visible in any direction, and the price she confirmed was firm at $38. "Why so cheap?" I asked. Paulette paused. "The estate has been trying to move it for 2 years. The previous owner, an older gentleman, lived alone, passed without close family. His affairs were eventually handled by the county. They just want it gone." We stood in the backyard after she went to take a call. The afternoon light came through the oaks at a long angle. My son was awake by then, running through the grass in his sneakers, picking up sticks. June slipped her hand into mine. "We could fix it," she said. "It's a lot of work," I said. "I know," she said, "but it's ours." We closed 5 weeks later. The first month was brutal in ways I hadn't fully prepared for. I'd done maintenance work for 15 years, but maintaining a building someone else owned was different from repairing something that bled money out of your own account every time something went wrong. The water heater failed in the second week. We replaced it ourselves, which saved labor costs but wiped out what I'd budgeted for the kitchen floor. June's father, who was retired and had more energy than men half his age, drove out on weekends to help. He'd worked construction in his younger years and knew things I didn't about load-bearing walls and drainage slopes, and which problems looked bad but weren't, and which ones looked fine but were. We set up a bedroom for our son first, then our own room, then started working outward. The drop ceiling in the kitchen came down, which revealed original tongue and groove pine boards above it that were in surprisingly good condition. June sanded them herself over the course of a week, a little at a time. The floors downstairs had to be releveled in 2 sections, which was a 2-weekend job with her father supervising and me doing the actual work on my hands and knees. It was during the 4th week that I found it. I was measuring the first floor hallway for baseboards. The house had a center hallway that ran from the front door to the back of the house, with the living room on the left, and what the listing called a study on the right, and then the kitchen at the back. I'd measured the hallway length from the outside of the front door to the outside of the back wall several times. I needed the number for a trim order. The exterior measurement was consistent, 42 feet, but when I measured the interior, door frame to back wall, adding the study and the kitchen together, I kept coming up short, 38.5 feet, maybe 39 if I was generous with the tape. I measured again, same result. I stood in the hallway for a long time, running the numbers in my head. 3 feet. Almost 3.5 feet of space that existed on the outside of the house, but not on the inside. I knocked on the study wall. Solid. I knocked on the hallway wall opposite. Also solid, but with a different resonance, less like knocking on a stud wall, more like knocking on something hollow behind drywall that had been skimmed and painted to match. I went and got a flashlight and looked at the baseboard along that wall. It was newer than the baseboards in every other room. Not by much, maybe 10 or 15 years newer, but when you've spent enough time in old houses, you notice those things. The paint on that section of wall had fewer layers than the rest of the hallway. Someone had drywalled over something and tried to match it. I called June into the hallway. "Feel this wall," I said. She pressed her palm flat against it. Then she knocked. She looked at me. "There's something back there," I said. We spent an evening debating it. Not the knocking through part, we knew we were going to do that, but the whether we should part. What if it was structural? What if we opened it up and found a plumbing issue that would cost more than we had? June's father came out the following Saturday and looked at the wall from the outside of the house, then from the inside, then walked the perimeter checking where the foundation sat. "It's not structural," he said, finally. "Whatever's back there, the house doesn't need that wall to stand up. It's just a wall someone put in." "Why would someone put in a wall?" June asked. Her father shrugged. "People do strange things in old houses, blocking off a drafty room, hiding a problem, sometimes just running out of money and closing off what they couldn't finish." I started cutting the following Tuesday, after work. I used an oscillating tool so I could go slow and feel for anything unexpected behind the drywall before I committed to a big opening. The drywall was standard 1/2 inch, screwed into framing that was newer than the house. 2x4s where the rest of the house used true dimension lumber. Whoever built this wall built it intentionally, with materials that weren't original to the house. When I'd cut a section about 2 feet square and pulled the piece free, I shone the flashlight into the gap. It wasn't a plumbing problem. It was a room. Not a large room, maybe 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep, running behind the study wall from the hallway toward the back of the house. The ceiling was low, maybe 6.5 feet. The floor was the original wide plank pine dusty and undisturbed. And against the far wall, partially hidden in shadow, was a steel cabinet, not decorative, industrial, the kind of thing you'd find in a commercial office or a records room. I stood there with the flashlight for probably 2 full minutes before I said anything. "June," I called. "Come here." She stood beside me and looked through the gap. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "The previous owner," she said slowly. "Paulette said he lived alone. No family. She said his affairs were handled by the county," I said. "So nobody knows what's in this house," she said. That was the part that settled in the room with us, like a third person standing there. We made the opening bigger the next morning, enough to walk through, ducking slightly. The room smelled like old paper and machine oil. The steel cabinet was locked with a padlock, but the padlock had corroded enough that when I applied pressure with a pry bar, the hasp pulled free from the cabinet frame rather than the lock itself breaking. Inside were 6 accordion file folders, the old-fashioned kind with elastic cord closures. Beneath the folders was a slim metal box, the kind used for storing documents flat, and inside the box was a single sealed envelope with no name on it, and beneath that envelope, a second set of papers held together with a rusted binder clip. I carried everything out into the kitchen and set it on the table. The accordion folders were financial records, not personal finance, not bank statements or tax returns. These were ledgers, handwritten in some places, printed in others, covering what looked like property transactions in Harmon County going back almost 20 years. The numbers were large, not household budget large, the kind of large that has commas in the wrong places. I'm not an accountant. I couldn't follow all of it at first, but I understood enough to see that the same properties appeared multiple times, bought and sold between different entities at prices that didn't make sense. A warehouse listed at $400,000 sold for $1.2 million to a company that turned around and sold it 8 months later for $300,000 to a different company, which then sold it back to the original owner's holding company at $800,000. The same assets cycling in circles, generating paper gains and losses that existed only on these pages. The sealed envelope was addressed, in handwritten block letters, to "Whoever fins this." I opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten in a shaky but legible script. The man's name was Alton. He'd worked as a bookkeeper for a commercial real estate firm called Harmon Valley Development for 11 years. The firm was controlled, he wrote, by a man named Clifford, not the owner of record, but the man who made every actual decision, who used the firm as a mechanism to move money through a series of shell companies he controlled under different names. The ledgers in the cabinet, Alton wrote, were copies he'd made over several years because he knew what he was documenting was wrong, and he was afraid that someday everything would disappear and no one would ever know. He'd tried once to bring it to a lawyer. The lawyer, he believed, was connected to Clifford's circle. 2 weeks after that meeting, Alton's car was broken into, his home office was entered while he was at church, and files he kept at his desk at work were removed without explanation. He didn't try again. Instead, he built the hidden room himself over the course of a summer, working alone, telling no one. He sealed the documents inside, and then sealed the room behind him. He wrote, "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the house is passed to someone who was not supposed to find this. That means it was meant to be found. Do something with it. Please." The second set of papers, the ones held together with the binder clip, were something else entirely. They were copies of deeds, 23 of them, covering properties throughout Harmon County and 2 adjacent counties. Each deed showed a chain of ownership that, when you traced it, led back to the same set of shell companies Alton had documented in the ledgers. One of those properties was a strip of land along the county's eastern edge, a corridor that ran adjacent to a state highway interchange. The deed transfers on that parcel showed it had been acquired by one of Clifford's entities at agricultural land prices, about $6,000 an acre, roughly 8 years ago. 2 years later, the county approved a commercial rezoning on that corridor. The land was now worth, conservatively, 40 times what Clifford had paid for it. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after June went to bed. I read Alton's letter 3 more times. I looked at the ledgers until my eyes ached. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't typically think in terms of moments that change everything. But I understood, sitting there under the kitchen light with those papers spread in front of me, that something had been left in this house, waiting for someone willing to do something with it. And that someone was apparently me. I called my wife's cousin Robbie the next day, not because Robbie was the most reliable person I knew, but because Robbie, in his years of forwarding links and digging into things nobody asked him to dig into, had once helped a neighbor successfully dispute a zoning decision by finding a procedural error in the county's public records. He knew how to navigate official documents. He knew who to call. "You need a whistleblower attorney," Robbie said, about 30 seconds into my explanation. "I don't know what that means," I said. "It means someone who knows how to take what you have to the right federal agency and do it in a way that protects you and gets the evidence in front of people who can actually act on it." Robbie, it turned out, had a contact. A woman he'd gone to high school with who'd become a paralegal at a firm in Columbus that handled financial fraud cases. He made a call. She called me that same afternoon. 3 days later, June and I drove to Columbus and sat in a conference room with 2 attorneys. We brought the ledgers, the letter, and the deeds. The attorneys, both of them careful, unhurried people who asked questions in a way that made me feel like they'd done this before, spent 2 hours going through the documents. At the end of the 2 hours, the senior attorney, a woman named Ms. Hartwell, folded her hands on the table. "These records are detailed," she said. "Unusually so. The question is whether the underlying transactions can be verified through public filings and county records." "Can they?" I asked. "We'll need time to check," she said. "But what I can tell you is that if they can, if these ledgers match what's on file with the county, then what's documented here constitutes evidence of a multi-year scheme involving fraudulent property transactions, potential tax evasion, and what looks like deliberate misrepresentation to commercial lenders." She looked at me steadily. "Mr. and Mrs. This is significant. It took 4 months. During those 4 months, we kept renovating the house. We finished the kitchen. We replaced the bathroom vanity and the soft spots in the floor. We painted the porch. We planted a garden because June had always wanted one, and we finally had the land for it. Our son started sleeping through the night in his room, in the house in Millhaven, in the life we were slowly building around ourselves. We heard updates through Ms. Hartwell every few weeks. The attorneys had confirmed the ledger entries against public county filings. The shell companies Alton had documented were real entities, registered in Delaware, with registered agents that led back through a maze of paperwork to Clifford's actual name on a handful of early filings he'd apparently failed to properly scrub. The rezoning of the highway corridor had been approved in a session where 2 of the 5 county commissioners had received significant contributions from a PAC tied to one of Clifford's entities 2 months prior. A federal investigation was opened. We were protected under the False Claims Act provisions that Ms. Hartwell had explained to us in that conference room in Columbus, meaning that if the investigation resulted in financial recoveries, we would be entitled to a percentage as the original disclosures. The morning I got the call from Ms. Hartwell with the final numbers, I was standing in the backyard watching my son throw a tennis ball at the oak tree closest to the house. He'd been trying to see if he could get it to bounce off the trunk and come back to him. It kept veering sideways into the grass. He kept walking over to retrieve it and trying again. The federal investigation resulted in a settlement. Clifford and 2 business partners agreed to pay back taxes, penalties, and civil forfeitures totaling just over $9 million to federal and state agencies. One partner took a plea agreement. Clifford himself received a 3-year supervised probation and a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any real estate entity in the state of Ohio. Under the whistleblower provisions, June and I received a relator's share. The amount was $212,000. I stood in the backyard for a long time after I hung up. My son had given up on the tennis ball and was lying in the grass looking at the sky. I walked over and lay down next to him. The oaks were enormous above us, the light coming through in pieces. "Dad," he said, "what are clouds made of?" "Water," I said. "Tiny drops of water, so light they float." He thought about that for a while. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "I know," I said. "But it's true. We paid off the house completely. We put a new roof on, real standing seam metal, the kind that lasts 50 years. We finished the upstairs rooms. June's mother, whose knees had been giving her trouble, moved into what had been the study, now a proper bedroom on the first floor so she didn't have to do stairs. We converted the hidden room, Alton's room, into a proper storage space, with good shelving and a light. We didn't seal it back up. It felt wrong to. I think about Alton sometimes. I think about a man who spent years watching something wrong happen around him, who was afraid and isolated and ultimately alone, who built himself a room and filled it with evidence and sealed it behind a wall because he didn't know what else to do, who wrote a letter to nobody and hoped that nobody would turn out to be somebody. The house he left behind was falling apart by the time we found it, but the room held, the papers held. The truth he'd written down in that shaky handwriting on 2 sheets of notebook paper, that held too. I think that's what he was counting on. We hung a photograph of the front of the house in the hallway, taken the week after we closed, when the porch was still sagging and the siding was still gray. The two of us standing in front of it with our son on my hip, all of us squinting into the sun. June said we should put it somewhere more visible, somewhere guests would see it. I said the hallway was right. You walk past it every day. You remember where you started.